Martin Jacques is a public intellectual and quite influential figure on public discourse on China internationally. A while ago, he wrote a book called When China Rules the World. Here it is. It did very well internationally, including in China, and was read by a lot of people, including a lot of policymakers. Jacques has a particular perspective about China. And given that he is so influential and well known, I want to raise some questions about his take in this video. I'm actually drawing here on some of the critiques put forward by William Callahan. He's a professor of international relations at LSE, and he's used the term Sino-speak to describe the kind of discourse that Martin Jacques and some others like him are putting forward about China. Callahan describes Sino-speak as a kind of discourse which presents an essentialized Chinese civilization that is culturally determined to rule Asia, if not the world. It's a way of talking about China and Chinese people based on an essentializing view of Chinese culture. Chinese culture is regarded as essentially Confucian and defined in contrast with the West and Western values. As Callahan points out, this is essentially singular. Chinese people are defined based on their Confucian heritage above other possibilities, and eternal. It's been that way for thousands of years and will never fundamentally change. Here's an example of Martin Jacques speaking in an interview with Aaron Bastani of Novara Media, which I think illustrates this.
China's actually existed a lot longer than 2,000 years because its civilization is so old and has had a sort of remarkable coherence given one's going back so long in history. Actually, if you look at what the way the Chinese think about themselves and what matters about China and what is distinctive about China, the relationship between state, very distinctive relationship between state and society, the importance of Confucian values, if you look at the language, if you look at the nature of the Chinese family, all of these things date back way before the end of the 19th century. They date back, over 2,000 years or more in many respects. So China, the modern China has grown out of Chinese civilization, whereas you wouldn't really say that of Western countries.
To be fair to Jacques, in his discussions about China, I think one of the things that he's trying to do is push back on a kind of discourse which for a long time was very popular in discussions in the West about China, which is that it is eventually going to evolve into a liberal democracy just like us. That is a very flawed idea, and Jacques is right to challenge it. But actually that view hasn't been very popular since probably the early 2000s. And the problem is, in pushing back against this idea, I think Jacques has perhaps gone too far the other way, resulting in this Sino-speak. Here are three ways in which I think he does that. First is something I've talked about a lot on this channel already. He presents this rather flawed idea that China's future will be fundamentally shaped by the legacy of its tribute system. Jacques makes this claim in his book, When China Rules the World, that the tribute system may well emerge in a new form and shape China's relations with its neighbouring states, who will, like China's tributary states supposedly did in the past, accept Chinese dominance over them based on their recognition of China's superior culture. And this may be the case, he suggests, possibly even as far away as New Zealand and Australia. And as is so often the case in Jacques' understanding of the tribute system, China's relations with its neighbours around it were essentially peaceful and non-coercive. Here he is again on Novara Media.
It had international system, a relationship to the tributary system, but it was neither military, political. It was primarily economic and to some extent cultural in terms of Confucian values and so on.
To be fair, in context, Jacques is making the point here that China did not expand overseas across the world in the way that the British Empire did. And that's true. But to go from there to making the claim that Chinese empires didn't expand through military force, that is not true, and actually obscures the many military and coercive aspects of China's history. I've talked quite a bit about this in another video. I'll put a link to that video in the description under this one in case you want to watch it afterwards. The second example of Sino-speak is, I think, Jacques' essentializing of Chinese culture based on fundamental difference from the West and Western values, and in doing so, I think he assumes a kind of singular, essentialized Western culture as well. Unfortunately, this kind of culturally essentializing discourse plays right into a quite unhealthy narrative of predetermined cultural conflict that is very helpful to nationalists on both sides, in China and also in the United States in particular. To quote Callahan again, although Jacques proudly displays his left-wing credentials, his arguments actually feed into hawkish notions of power politics on both sides of the Pacific, which see China and the US as destined for conflict. Again, to be fair to Jacques, the host on this interview does call him out on that particular issue, and he does respond. I didn't find his response that convincing, but watch the interview and see what you think. And third, coming back to this idea of China and Chinese culture being essentially determined by their Confucian heritage. Jacques, as you saw from that previous clip, talks about Confucian values related to the family in particular. Again, to be fair to Jacques, in his book, he does say that Confucianism is quite flexible and adaptable, and this is one of the reasons it's been so popular in China for so long. But I'm not sure how flexible he really thinks Chinese culture is. The point I want to make here is that, of course, Confucianism has hugely influenced Chinese culture, but there are many other influences too, and in the end, people have autonomy and agency and are able to make political and social choices, which culturally essentializing accounts of the kind that Jacques is putting forward doesn't really leave much room for. There's lots I could say on this, and perhaps I'll say more in future videos, but one of the most interesting social trends that I think is going on in China at the moment is the feminist movement, and in particular a major pushback by urban educated women against attempts, repeated attempts, by the Chinese state to encourage women to get married earlier and to have more children. I want to suggest that the Sino-speak of Martin Jacques doesn't really seem to be able to account for phenomenon like this particularly well. So as a counterpoint to the way that Martin Jacques is talking about Chinese culture here, I want to show you a clip from a recent discussion taken from a book talk event with Later Hong Fincher. Here, she and a discussant, Emily Whalen, are talking about gender inequality in China and discrimination against women within families. And in doing so, they are pushing back on this essentializing way of talking about Chinese culture in, I think, some really interesting ways. In particular, how culture and cultural norms are not ahistorical, and also how what gets to count as culture is very often bound up with state policies connected to the plans of the state at that particular moment.
A couple of things. One, authoritarian regimes don't exist in the absence of popular support. They do need popular legitimacy, and one of the ways in which they can garner this popular legitimacy is, again, calling back to restrictive gender norms. The other thing that I notice is how malleable the concept of culture is. So by emphasizing or amplifying certain aspects of traditional culture, the Chinese Communist Party is actually defining what Chinese culture is in this particular moment. Culture is always changing. It's not ontological. It doesn't exist outside of the course of history. And so what I think we've seen over the past 10 years are really the effects of that cultural engineering as well. The pressure that these women are experiencing from their families and sort of the accepted discrimination that women receive from their own families. Those are things that are not necessarily inherent in Chinese culture, but have been engineered to be that way by the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that that's important as well.
So I really agree with everything that you were saying.
Yeah.
One of the things is that so many people in China say, oh, this is just Chinese culture. But yeah, I completely agree. No, it's not just Chinese culture. Yes, there is, a heavily patriarchal tradition in Confucianism. And I like comparing China to Japan and South Korea, for example, but that's a whole other topic of female labor force participation. But But the culture, it's perceived to be culture, but so much of it really is dictated through government policy and through propaganda, molding people's thoughts to, make people believe that, this is just naturally occurring.
I hope you'll find this thought-provoking. Thank you for watching.